peasant woman could not pay her debts. So the Duke paid them and made her his wife. The church bell tolls as a barefoot widow stands trembling in the village court. The steward raises his voice. Her debts are too heavy. Her children will be taken, her future destroyed. Dust swirls as the crowd jeers. Then the ground stills. A carriage door opens. A duke, tall, proud, untouchable, steps forward and throws down gold. Gasps echo through the square. And in a voice cold as steel, he declares, "She will be my wife." Whispers ripple. What kind of man saves a woman only to bind her in marriage? Why does he need her so desperately? And when his scheming cousin brings forth a damning secret from her past, will this fragile union be torn apart before it ever begins? What is stronger, birthright and pride, or love powerful enough to rewrite destiny? I'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Type it down below, and while you're here, subscribe so you'll always catch the next story. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square as Margaret Hawley walked with measured steps toward the manor's debt court, her children's small hands nestled in hers. Thomas on her right, Eliza on her left. The weight of her weary body matched the heaviness in her heart. She had spent the night bent over endless mending work, squinting by precious candlelight until her fingers grew numb and her eyes burned. "Mama, why must we go to the big house?" Eliza whispered, her 7-year-old face pinched with worry beneath her worn wool cap. "Hush now, dear one," Margaret murmured, squeezing her daughter's hand. The morning air bit through her thin shawl, and wisps of smoke curled up from cottage chimneys into the steel-gray autumn sky. As they passed the village well, 2 women, drawing water, bent their heads together, their whispers following Margaret like autumn leaves in the wind. Thomas, ever protective at 10 years old, walked straighter and lifted his chin. "Don't listen to them, Mama," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. The great hall of the manor house loomed before them, its windows gleaming cold in the morning light. Already, a crowd had gathered, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, all waiting for the debt court to begin. Margaret felt their stares as she guided her children to stand near the back, trying to make themselves small against the stone wall. The steward, Master Simmons, appeared at his high desk, his quill poised over the great ledger book. His thin lips pressed together as he shuffled through his papers, and Margaret's heart sank. She knew what was written there: the mounting debts her husband had left behind, the borrowed money for seed that had yielded poor harvests, the unpaid rents that had accumulated during his long illness. "Margaret Hawley," the steward called, his voice carrying across the hushed hall. She stepped forward, her children clinging to her skirts. The wooden floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she approached the desk. "The accounts show outstanding debts of £43, 6 shillings and 8 pence, Master Simmons announced, each number falling like a stone into the quiet room. "Plus interest of—" The whispers grew louder. Margaret felt her cheeks burn as she heard fragments of conversation. Her husband never could manage ... always reaching above their station ... What's to become of those poor children ... "Please, sir," Margaret began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands, "if I might have more time." "Time?" Master Simmons's eyebrows rose. "Time has been given, Mrs. Hawley. 3 extensions already. The law is clear regarding debtors who cannot pay. The law, indeed." A new voice cut through the hall, deep and commanding. The crowd parted like a wave as Edward, Duke of Rothwell, strode into the hall. His tall figure, clad in fine dark wool and gleaming boots, commanded immediate attention. The whispers died away, replaced by the rustle of bodies bowing and curtsying. Margaret felt her children press closer to her sides as the Duke approached. His face was composed, almost stern, but something in his eyes as they met hers seemed less cold than she remembered from his rare appearances in the village. "Your Grace," Master Simmons stammered, half rising from his seat. "We did not expect—" "Clearly not," the Duke replied. He turned his attention to the ledger. "Mrs. Hale's debts. You are about to pass judgment?" "Yes, Your Grace. The law requires—" "The law requires justice," the Duke interrupted smoothly. "And justice, in this case, shall be tempered with mercy." He reached into his coat and withdrew a leather purse that landed with a heavy clink on the steward's desk. "I believe this will cover the full amount with interest." A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Margaret's legs trembled so badly she feared she might fall, but she forced herself to remain standing straight and tall. Thomas's grip on her skirt tightened, while Eliza stared up at the Duke with wide eyes. "But Your Grace," Master Simmons protested weakly, the precedent I choose to set," the Duke said firmly, "is one of compassion where it is deserved. Mrs. Hale's debts are paid in full. Let it be recorded as such." The gathered villagers erupted in murmurs of amazement and speculation. Margaret stood frozen, unable to comprehend this sudden turn of fortune, as the Duke of Rothwell turned toward her with an almost imperceptible nod before striding from the hall, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. The heavy thud of coin purses hitting the wooden table echoed through the debt court. The steward's mouth hung open as he stared at the gleaming stack before him. Edward, Duke of Rothwell, stood tall and commanding, his deep blue coat a stark contrast to the drab grays and browns of the villagers gathered around. "I trust this will settle the matter in full," Edward said, his cultured voice carrying across the now silent room. The steward scrambled to count the coins, his fingers trembling. "Yes, Your Grace, more than enough to cover all debts," the steward stammered, bowing repeatedly. Margaret clutched her children's hands tighter, her heart pounding against her ribs. Thomas pressed closer to her side while little Eliza peered up at the Duke with wide eyes. The whispers that had condemned her moments ago turned to gasps of wonder. Edward turned to face the assembled crowd, his expression grave. "There is a matter of honor to address," he announced. "My late father owed a great debt to Margaret Hale's family, one that was never properly settled. I intend to right this wrong." He paused, his steel-gray eyes finding Margaret's. "I shall take Mistress Halley as my wife." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. A noble duke marry a farmer's widow? It seemed impossible, like something from a fairy story her mother once told her. "Your Grace," she managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the growing commotion. I don't understand." "All will be explained in time," Edward replied quietly, then raised his voice to address the crowd once more. "A carriage will collect Mistress Halley and her children this evening. That will be all." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Margaret moved through her tiny cottage like a person in a dream, gathering their few belongings into bundles. Thomas helped her fold their spare clothes while Eliza clutched her worn rag doll, asking endless questions about their new home. As the sun began to set, the promised carriage arrived. Its polished wood and gleaming brass fixtures looked out of place among the humble cottages. The driver, dressed in the Duke's livery, helped them inside with careful courtesy that Margaret had never ridden in a carriage before. The plush velvet seats felt foreign beneath her rough hands. As they rolled through the village, she caught glimpses of familiar faces watching from windows and doorways. The same neighbors who had shunned her that morning now curtsied as the carriage passed. The road wound through bare autumn trees, climbing steadily until Rothwell Manor appeared before them. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Dozens of windows glowed with warm candlelight, making the great house shine like a constellation against the darkening sky. Stone griffins guarded the sweeping front steps where a row of footmen stood at attention, Look, Mama. Eliza pressed her face to the window. It's like a castle. Thomas remained silent, but his eyes were wide as he took in the sprawling stables, the manicured gardens, and the sheer size of the place that was to be their new home. The carriage came to a stop, and a footman opened the door. Margaret stepped down carefully, helping her children after her. The grand entrance hall dazzled her eyes with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers. A gray-haired housekeeper curtsied deeply. Welcome, Mistress Halley. I'm Mrs. Potter. If you'll follow me, I'll show you to your chambers. They climbed a wide staircase, their boots silent on thick carpets. The housekeeper led them down a corridor lined with paintings of stern-faced ancestors, finally stopping at a heavy wooden door. These will be your rooms until the wedding, Mrs. Potter explained, lighting fresh candles from the one she carried. His Grace thought you might prefer to have the children near you for now. The chamber was larger than their entire cottage. A fire crackled in the hearth, warming the space. 2 small beds had been prepared for the children in an adjoining room. Everything spoke of comfort and wealth beyond Margaret's wildest dreams. After Mrs. Potter left them, Margaret helped her exhausted children prepare for bed. Once they were tucked in and sleeping peacefully, she knelt beside her own bed, so much softer than her old straw mattress at home. Dear Lord, she whispered, clasping her hands together, please guide me. I don't understand why this has happened or what tomorrow may bring. Help me protect my children and do what's right. She glanced at Thomas and Eliza's peaceful faces. In the flickering candlelight, and ... Thank you for this miracle, even if it frightens me. The morning sun streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across Rothwell Manor's breakfast room. Margaret smoothed the hastily altered gown that the housekeeper had found for her, its navy fabric plain but respectable. Her fingers traced the rough stitches she had sewn late into the night, trying to make the garment suitable for her new station. Mrs. Brooks, the kindly housekeeper, had introduced Margaret to the household staff earlier that morning. This is our new mistress, she had announced, and the servants had curtsied with genuine warmth. The cook had even slipped Thomas and Eliza each a fresh-baked sweet roll, making their eyes light up with delight. But now, seated beside Edward at the breakfast table, Margaret felt the sharp sting of different treatment. Lady Ashworth's lip curled as she buttered her toast. How ... Quaint to see such rustic charm at the Duke's table, she murmured to her companion, just loud enough for Margaret to hear. Margaret kept her eyes on her plate, though her cheeks burned. Edward, engaged in discussion with his steward, seemed not to notice the lady's disdain. The fine china felt foreign in her work-roughened hands, and she took small, careful bites of unfamiliar delicacies. By afternoon, the Manor's grand drawing room filled with local nobility summoned to hear Edward's announcement. Margaret stood beside him, painfully aware of her simple appearance among the rustling silk gowns and glittering jewels of the assembled ladies. I am pleased to announce my forthcoming marriage to Mistress Halley, Edward declared, his voice steady and authoritative. The ceremony will take place within the month. The response was immediate, though carefully masked behind painted fans and false smiles. A milkmaid duchess, one young lady whispered to another. How absolutely pastoral. I suppose even peasant women can catch a duke these days, came another whisper. Sharp as needles. Margaret lifted her chin, drawing on the quiet dignity that had sustained her through harder times. Yet each barbed comment lodged in her heart, reminding her how far she stood from this glittering world. As the gathering dispersed, Margaret found herself alone in the corridor outside Edward's study. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, and voices drifted out clearly. Your Grace, the terms of your father's will are quite specific, an elderly man was saying, Edward's solicitor, by his tone. You must wed a woman of proven virtue before your 30th birthday or the estate passes to Lord Blackthorn. "I am well aware, Mr. Patterson," Edward replied, his voice tight with tension. "That is precisely why I chose Mistress Holly. Her reputation for moral character is beyond reproach. Despite her reduced circumstances, the old Duke would have approved of such simple virtue." Margaret's heart seemed to freeze in her chest. Not love, not even simple kindness, had prompted Edward's rescue. She was merely a convenient solution to his inheritance crisis, respectable enough to satisfy his father's will, humble enough to be grateful for the elevation. The sound of approaching footsteps sent Margaret hurrying away, her mind whirling. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, going through the motions of learning her new household duties, while her thoughts churned with this new understanding. Night fell, and Margaret lay in her grand new bed, listening to the pop and crackle of the fireplace. The sheets were silk, the mattress stuffed with the finest down, yet sleep eluded her. Beside her, Thomas and Eliza slumbered peacefully, their faces smooth and untroubled in the flickering firelight. She watched them sleep, her precious children now guaranteed a future she could never have provided on her own. A duchess's children would never know hunger or shame. They would have education, opportunity, position in society, yet her heart ached with the knowledge that she was merely a piece in Edward's carefully calculated game. Gratitude for her children's security warred with despair at the loveless arrangement she faced. The fire's dancing shadows seemed to mock her with the warmth she feared she would never find in her new life. Margaret woke while stars still dotted the pre-dawn sky. Years of farm life had trained her body to rise before the sun, and even here in the grandeur of Rothwell Manor, that habit remained. She dressed quietly, careful not to wake Thomas and Eliza, who slumbered peacefully in their adjoining chamber. The Manor's corridors were quiet save for the soft pad of her feet on the carpeted floors. Following the scent of yeast and wood smoke, she found her way to the bustling kitchen, where servants were already preparing for the day ahead. "Milady," Mrs. Cooper, the cook, nearly dropped her rolling pin in surprise. "You need not be down here." At this hour, Margaret smiled warmly. "Please, let me help. I have always found peace in morning baking." Without waiting for permission, she rolled up her sleeves and plunged her hands into a waiting bowl of dough. The kitchen maids exchanged glances of wonder as Margaret kneaded alongside them, her movements sure and practiced. Soon, the air filled with quiet chatter and the comfortable sounds of work. "Never thought we'd see a future duchess working dough," whispered Sally, a young scullery maid, to her friend. "And doing it proper, too." "She has kind hands," murmured Beth, the assistant cook. "See how gentle-like she shapes the loaves." By breakfast time, the kitchen rang with easy laughter. Margaret had shared her secret for making the crusts extra crispy, and Mrs. Cooper had taught her the Manor's special way of braiding ceremonial bread. The morning passed in a blur of flour-dusted contentment. That evening at supper, Edward noticed something different about the service. His staff moved with unusual enthusiasm, and several times he caught them beaming at Margaret with genuine affection. When she thanked the footman by name, "James, the soup is especially fine tonight," Edward saw the young man stand straighter, pride evident in his bearing. "You seem to have won over the household," Edward remarked later, his tone curious rather than critical. Margaret met his gaze steadily. "They are good people, my lord. They deserve kindness as much as any of us." Days flowed one into another. Margaret established a routine of teaching Thomas and Eliza their letters in the library each afternoon. She would sit with them at the great oak table, sunlight streaming through tall windows as she guided their small hands in forming their alphabets. "Mama, look," Eliza would exclaim, holding up her practice sheet. "I wrote my name all by myself." "Very well done, my dear," Margaret would praise, while Thomas bent seriously over his own work, determined to master his sums. What Margaret did not see was Edward's silent presence. He often paused in the library doorway, drawn by their quiet industry. His stern features would soften as he watched Thomas help his sister sound out difficult words, or saw Margaret praise their efforts with gentle encouragement. One evening, as Margaret sat alone in the library after the children had gone to bed, Edward entered carrying a leather-bound Bible and a single candlestick. "I thought perhaps ... double quotes." He cleared his throat. "That is, would you care to hear the evening scripture?" Margaret looked up, surprised by this unexpected gesture. "I would like that very much, my lord." Edward settled into the chair beside her, the candle casting warm light across the pages. His deep voice filled the quiet room as he read from the Book of Ruth, the words speaking of loyalty and unexpected grace. Margaret found herself drawn not just to the familiar verses, but to the gentle way Edward's voice shaped them. His usual sharp edges seemed softened in the candlelight, and when their eyes met briefly over the sacred words, she felt her heart flutter in a way that both thrilled and frightened her. In that moment of shared peace, with the candle burning low and the night pressing against the windows, something shifted between them, subtle as a change in the wind, yet profound as the turning of seasons. The autumn sun cast long shadows across the village green as parishioners filed out of the stone church. Margaret walked beside Edward, her modest blue wool dress a stark contrast to the fine silks and brocades worn by the other noble ladies. Though weeks had passed since their engagement announcement, she still felt the weight of curious stares upon her. The harvest feast table stretched across the green, laden with roasted meats, fresh bread, and steaming vegetables from the villagers' gardens. Cheerful music from pipes and fiddles filled the air, mixing with the happy chatter of children playing among hay bales. "Your Grace," called out Thomas Miller, one of the village elders, his voice carrying across the crowd. "A word, if you please." The old man's weather-worn face bore the stern expression Margaret had come to recognize from her years among the common folk, the look of someone with grievances to air. Edward straightened, his shoulders tensing as several other villagers gathered behind Miller. "Of course," he replied, his tone carefully measured. "The mill wheel's been broken these 3 months," Miller declared, "and the bridge to the north field needs mending before winter. We've sent word, but nothing's been done." More voices joined in, listing complaints about leaking roofs and broken fences. Margaret watched Edward's jaw tighten, saw the familiar mask of aristocratic distance settling over his features. But she also remembered the lengthy letters she'd seen him writing late into the night, the careful attention he paid to his ledgers. "If I may speak," Margaret stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. All eyes turned to her, the farmer's daughter who would soon be their duchess. "This very morning, I saw His Grace approve funds for new timbers for the mill. And just last week, he sent his own carpenter to survey the bridge." She continued, warming to her subject. "Each day, I watch him read every petition, consider every request. He's ordered grain to be distributed to widows before winter comes, and arranged for the physician to treat 3 sick children without charge." The villagers exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Old Miller's expression softened. "Is this true, Your Grace?" Edward looked at Margaret with wonder in his eyes before turning to his tenants. "It is. The repairs will begin tomorrow, weather permitting. I should have better communicated my plans." "Well then," called out the innkeeper, raising his mug. "To our Duke and his lady." The crowd cheered, lifting their own drinks in celebration. The tension dissolved into laughter and good cheer as the feast began in earnest thought throughout the afternoon. Margaret noticed the change in how the villagers approached Edward. They spoke more openly, shared stories of their children, even joked with him. And Edward, to her delight, seemed to relax into this warmer relationship with his people. As evening drew near, they began the walk back to the manor. Edward carried a brass lantern that cast a gentle glow on the path ahead. The autumn air had grown crisp, and Margaret drew her shawl closer. "You defended me today," Edward said softly. "No one has done that since my mother passed." "I spoke only truth," Margaret replied. "These past weeks, I've seen the care you take with your responsibilities. The villagers needed to know. I've spent so many years maintaining proper distance." He admitted, "I thought that was what being a duke required. But you've shown me a different way." His voice grew tender. "You've given me back my people's trust." They reached the manor's courtyard, where torchlit stone walls rose against the star-filled sky. Edward set down the lantern and turned to face her. Margaret's breath caught as he took her hand in his. "Margaret," he whispered, and the sound of her name on his lips made her heart flutter. Slowly, reverently, he raised her hand to his mouth. His kiss, when it came, was soft as a whisper against her skin, yet it sent warmth coursing through her entire being. Their eyes met in the lantern light, both stunned by the intensity of the moment. Margaret felt the tremor in his touch, saw the vulnerability in his gaze. For a long moment, they stood frozen in the starlit courtyard, neither willing to break the spell that had fallen over them. The crisp autumn afternoon shattered with the sudden rumble of carriage wheels on the manor's cobblestones. Margaret, who had been watching Thomas and Eliza play in the garden, felt her heart sink as Lord Blackthorn's ornate black carriage pulled to a stop before the main entrance. The horse's breath steamed in the cool air as footmen rushed to assist their unwelcome guest. Lord Blackthorn emerged like a shadow made flesh, his elegant black coat and gleaming boots a stark contrast to his sallow complexion. His thin lips curved into what might have passed for a smile, though it never reached his cold eyes. "What a charming domestic scene," he drawled, watching the children scurry behind their mother's skirts. The household transformed within moments of his arrival. Servants who had begun to move with ease in Margaret's presence now scurried through hallways with downcast eyes. The cook's usually cheerful kitchen fell silent, save for the necessary clatter of pots and pans. Even the very air seemed to grow heavier, as though the manor itself recoiled from Lord Blackthorn's presence. That evening's supper proved an exquisite. Candlelight flickered across the fine china and crystal glasses, casting dancing shadows on the dining room's oak-paneled walls. Several local gentry families had already been invited to dine, making escape impossible. Margaret sat rigid in her chair, feeling every eye upon her as the first course was served. Lord Blackthorn waited until the soup bowls were nearly empty before he struck. "I must say, Edward," he began, swirling his wine glass with practiced elegance, "your choice of bride has set many tongues wagging, though perhaps not as many as the bride herself once did." A terrible silence fell over the table. Margaret's spoon trembled against her bowl. "Whatever do you mean, cousin?" Edward's voice was tight, controlled. "Oh, come now." Blackthorn reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document with theatrical flourish. "I have here sworn statements from patrons of the King's Arms Tavern in Sheffield. They remember quite clearly a serving girl named Margaret who bore a striking resemblance to your intended, one who was rather friendly with the customers." Gasps rippled through the assembled guests. The Countess of Wendover pressed her handkerchief to her lips, while her husband harumphed into his napkin. Margaret felt the blood drain from her face as she looked to Edward, silently pleading for him to defend her. But Edward said nothing. His face had turned to stone, his eyes fixed on his plate, as though the answers to all life's mysteries might be found in his untouched roast pheasant. The silence stretched like a blade against Margaret's throat. "I have never worked in any tavern," Margaret finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was a farmer's wife, then his widow. nothing more. Naturally, you would deny it. Blackthorne smiled, sliding the paper toward Edward. But perhaps his grace should examine the evidence himself. The remainder of the meal passed in a blur of whispered conversations and averted gazes. Margaret could hardly swallow past the lump in her throat, while Edward retreated further into stony silence with each course. When at last the torture ended, he excused himself immediately to his study. Through the long evening hours that followed, Margaret moved like a ghost through the manor's halls. She tucked Thomas and Eliza into bed, forcing herself to smile as she kissed their foreheads and promised all would be well. But her children were perceptive beyond their years. "Why was that man so cruel to you, Mama?" Eliza asked, her small face pinched with worry. "Hush now," Margaret soothed, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Sleep sweet, my loves." From the corridor, she could see lamplight spilling from beneath Edward's study door. The occasional clink of crystal against crystal told her he sought comfort in his finest brandy. Her heart ached to go to him, to defend her honor, to demand he speak on her behalf. Instead, she turned away, climbing the stairs to her chamber with leaden feet. Inside her room, Margaret moved with quiet determination. She pulled her old carpet bag from beneath the bed and began to pack. Her few belongings, the worn dresses she had brought from her cottage, her mother's prayer book, the children's spare clothes. Tears fell silently as she worked, but she refused to wipe them away. She would leave at first light before the household stirred, taking her children and her dignity with her. The first pale light of dawn crept across the frosted grounds of Rothwell Manor, painting the world in shades of silver and pearl. Margaret stood in her chamber, her worn traveling cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, as she gazed at her children's sleeping faces one last time before waking them. The room still held the dying warmth of the night's fire, but her heart felt colder than the frost outside. "Thomas, Eliza," she whispered, gently rousing them. "We must go now, my loves." The children stirred, blinking in confusion at their mother's grave expression. They had learned early in life not to question such moments, and they dressed quickly. In the dim light, Margaret clasped their small hands in hers, drawing strength from their trusting touch. The corridor stretched before them, silent save for their soft footsteps on the stone floor. The servants would not begin their daily tasks for another hour, the perfect time to slip away without notice. But fate had other plans. As they rounded the corner toward the servants' stairs, Edward's tall figure emerged from the shadows. He stood like a statue in his riding clothes, clearly having spent a sleepless night in his study. His face bore the haunted look of a man trapped between duty and desire. "You mean to leave without a word?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Margaret straightened her spine, though her heart trembled. "I will not stay where my honor is questioned, and my presence brings shame to your house, your grace." "Margaret, please." He stepped forward, but she moved back, keeping the children behind her. "What would you have me do?" Her voice cracked with emotion. "Stay to be ridiculed? Watch you struggle between your inheritance and the scandal of a common-born wife?" The tears she had held back all night began to fall, striking the stone floor. "Like rain, you did not defend me." Edward's face twisted with pain. "The inheritance clause." "Yes, the inheritance," Margaret cut in, her words sharp with hurt. "That is what truly matters, is it not? Not love, not truth, not the hearts you wound in pursuit of it." She drew a shaky breath. "I release you from any obligation to me. Lord Blackthorne can have his victory." She moved to pass him, but Edward caught her arm. "Margaret, let me go," she whispered, not meeting his eyes. "Please." His fingers loosened, and Margaret hurried past him, her children's footsteps quick and light beside her. The sound of their departure echoed through the empty corridor. Like a funeral bell, the morning grew older as Edward paced in his study, the weight of his choice pressing down upon him like a physical thing. A knock at the door interrupted his dark thoughts. His steward entered, clutching a handful of papers. "Your Grace," the old man began, his face grave but determined. "I've discovered something about Lord Blackthorn's evidence." He spread the documents across Edward's desk. "These papers, the ones claiming Mistress Holly worked in a tavern, they bear the seal of the Golden Crown in Leicester." Edward leaned forward, frowning. "And?" "The Golden Crown is owned by one of Lord Blackthorn's creditors, Your Grace, the same man who holds several of his gambling debts." The steward's eyes gleamed with righteous anger. "The dates are wrong as well. According to these, Mistress Holly would have been serving ale when she was but 12 years old." Edward's hands clenched into fists. "Forged. All of it forged." But the revelation brought little comfort. The damage was done. Even false rumors could destroy the inheritance clause that demanded a wife of unblemished reputation. Outside the manor gates, Margaret helped Thomas and Eliza into the hired cart, its wooden wheels creaking under their modest belongings. The driver, an old farmer she knew from the village, clucked sympathetically as he secured their trunk. Edward stood at the gates, his tall figure stark against the gray sky. As the cart began to move, the first snow of winter began to fall, delicate flakes drifting down to dust Margaret's dark hair and catch on her eyelashes. She did not look back, but kept her gaze fixed forward, her children pressed close to her sides for warmth. The cart rolled away into the swirling snow, taking with it Edward's chance at happiness. A price paid for choosing duty over love. Margaret stood at the cracked window of her village cottage, watching snowflakes dance in the bitter wind. The small room held only a rough wooden table, 2 stools, and the narrow bed she shared with Eliza. Thomas slept on a straw pallet near the hearth, where dying embers struggled against the chill. Perdance the chill. "Mama, I'm cold," Eliza whispered, huddling closer to the meager fire. Margaret wrapped her own shawl around her daughter's thin shoulders, forcing a smile she didn't feel. "The wood merchant promised us another bundle tomorrow, sweet one. For now, we'll keep warm by moving about." She set them to sweeping the rough floorboards, trying to ignore how the wind whistled through gaps in the walls. Smoke from the failing fire filled the cottage with a gray haze. Margaret's eyes stung, but not just from the smoke. Every shadow, every corner of this humble dwelling reminded her of what they'd lost, not just Edward's grand manor, but the brief, shining hope of a better life. Meanwhile, at Rothwell Manor, old Joseph Harper limped through the servants' hall, his arthritic hands clutching a leather pouch. The aged man had served Margaret's first husband as a stable hand years ago, and news of her departure had stirred long-buried memories. He found Edward in his study, slumped before a cold hearth, a half-empty wine goblet forgotten on the desk. "Your Grace," Joseph's voice quavered, "I must speak about Mistress Holly." Edward's head lifted slowly, his eyes haunted. "What of her?" "The tavern tale Lord Blackthorn spoke of. I know the truth of it, sir. I was there." Joseph's gnarled fingers opened the leather pouch, withdrawing carefully preserved papers. "These are receipts from the apothecary, dated 5 years past. Young Thomas was dying of fever, and her husband lay injured from a fall. The local inn needed extra help during the harvest fair." Edward straightened, reaching for the faded documents. Joseph continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "She worked 3 nights, serving ale and clearing tables. Every penny went to medicine that saved her son's life. 'Twas an act of desperate love, Your Grace, not shame." The Duke's hands trembled as he read the careful notation of payments made. 3 nights, he whispered. "She worked 3 nights to save her child, and I let Blackthorn's lies poison my heart." Rising abruptly, Edward strode to the window. Beyond the glass, sleet pelted the manor grounds, turning snow to treacherous slush. "Saddle my horse," he commanded. "Your Grace, the weather. Now, Joseph. I've already waited too long." Minutes later, Edward thundered through the manor gates, his heavy cloak offering little protection against the driving sleet. Mud splattered his boots and breeches as his horse plowed through rutted lanes. The bitter wind cut through layers of wool and leather, but he barely felt it. His mind filled with memories of Margaret's quiet dignity, her children's trusting smiles, the way her eyes had shone with hurt when he failed to defend her. Village women paused in their doorways as the Duke of Rothwell rode past, his fine clothes soaked and muddied. They watched in growing amazement as he dismounted before Margaret's cottage, dropping to his knees in the wet snow. "Margaret!" His voice carried clearly in the hushed afternoon air. "Margaret Halley." Inside the cottage, Margaret froze at the sound of his voice. Thomas and Eliza ran to the window, pressing their faces against the clouded glass. "Mama, it's the Duke!" Eliza exclaimed. Margaret's heart thundered as she opened the door. Edward knelt before her, heedless of his sodden state, his proud head bowed. "I come to beg your forgiveness," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I learned the truth of your sacrifice, how you worked those nights at the inn to save Thomas. I was a fool to doubt your virtue, blinded by pride and fear of losing my inheritance." A crowd began to gather, villagers drawn by the extraordinary sight of a duke on his knees in the snow. Their whispers filled the air like rustling leaves, but Margaret heard nothing but the earnest plea in Edward's voice. "You chose a mother's love over pride," he continued, "while I chose inheritance over truth. I am shamed by your example and humbled by your courage. If you can find it in your heart to forgive me." Margaret trembled in the doorway of her cottage as Edward's strong voice rang out across the village square. The morning sun caught the fresh snow, making it sparkle like diamonds scattered across the muddy ground. A crowd had gathered, drawn by the sight of their Duke standing tall in his fine coat, his face set with determination. "Hear me, good people of the village," Edward called out, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. "Lord Blackthorne has deceived us all. His claims against Mistress Halley were nothing but lies born of greed and malice." The villagers pressed closer, their breaths visible in the cold air. Thomas and Eliza clung to their mother's skirts, their eyes wide as they watched the scene unfold. The baker's wife clutched her hands to her chest, and the blacksmith removed his cap in respect. "Margaret Halley is a woman of virtue and honor," Edward continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, she worked at an inn, but only to save her dying husband with medicine she could not otherwise afford. Such sacrifice speaks not of shame, but of the purest love." Turning to face Margaret, Edward took 3 steps forward and, to everyone's astonishment, dropped to one knee in the snow. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. The proud Duke of Rothwell, heir to one of the greatest estates in the land, knelt before a common widow. "Margaret," he said, his voice softer now but still clear enough for all to hear, "I ask your forgiveness for doubting you. I have been a fool, valuing pride over truth, position over love. I kneel before you not as a duke, but as a man who has found his heart's match. Will you grant me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears welled in Margaret's eyes as she looked down at Edward. The crowd held their breath, waiting. Even the winter birds seemed to pause their morning songs. "Your inheritance," Margaret whispered, though in the hushed square many heard her words. "You could lose everything." "Then I shall lose it gladly," Edward declared, "for a life without you would be the poorest existence of all." The church bells suddenly began to toll, their joyous pealing echoing across the village. Children who had been watching from windows and doorways began to emerge, their faces bright with excitement at the unfolding fairy tale before them. Margaret's hands trembled as she reached out to Edward. "Yes," she said, her voice growing stronger. "Yes, I will marry you." A cheer erupted from the crowd, and Edward rose to his feet, drawing Margaret into his arms. Thomas and Eliza bounced with excitement, their previous sorrows forgotten in the joy of the moment. Then, through the celebrating crowd came the sound of approaching hooves. A royal steward, his livery bearing the king's seal, rode into the square. The villagers parted to make way, their celebrations quieting as he dismounted. "Your Grace," the steward called out, bowing low to Edward, "I bring news from London. Lord Blackthorn's deceptions have been uncovered. His creditors have come forward with proof of his extensive debts and forgeries." Edward kept one arm around Margaret as he listened, while Thomas and Eliza pressed close to their mother's sides. "Furthermore," the steward continued, "the investigation into Mistress Hale's character has proven her absolute integrity. The inheritance clause is satisfied in full. Your lands and title remain secure, Your Grace." Another cheer rose from the crowd, even louder than before. The baker's wife began to weep with joy, and several men threw their caps into the air. Edward turned to Margaret, his eyes shining with love and triumph. She fell into his embrace as their children rushed forward to join them. Edward lifted Eliza into his arms, while Thomas wrapped his arms around both his mother and his soon-to-be father. The village square erupted in celebration. Women wiped tears from their eyes, men clapped each other on the back, and children danced in circles around the embracing family. The church bells continued their joyous song, ringing out across the snow-covered fields, declaring to all that love had triumphed over malice, truth over deception, and that happiness had finally found its way to both duke and widow alike. The village church glowed with morning light as Reverend Clark's voice rang clear through the hushed sanctuary. "I publish the banns of marriage between Edward, Duke of Rothwell, and Mistress Margaret Hawley for the third and final time." The congregation shifted in their wooden pews, still marveling at the sight of Margaret, dressed in her finest borrowed gown, seated beside Edward in the front row. Later that afternoon, the chapel filled with the sweet perfume of winter roses and flickering beeswax candles. Margaret walked down the aisle in a simple cream-colored dress, her children beaming as they carried her train. Thomas stood tall and proud, while little Eliza scattered rose petals from a silver basket. Servants and villagers packed the pews, their Sunday best brightening the stone walls with splashes of color. Edward's eyes never left Margaret as she approached the altar. His voice remained steady as he spoke his vows, though his hands trembled slightly as he slipped the gold band onto her finger. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, the chapel erupted in joyous celebration. That evening, the great hall of Rothwell Manor blazed with warmth from the massive hearth. Garlands of evergreen decorated the walls and trestle tables, groaned under the weight of roasted meats, fresh bread, and winter fruits. Noble ladies who had once scorned Margaret now curtsied deeply as she passed. Tenant farmers raised their cups in toast beside silk-clad lords, all equal in the celebration of love's triumph. As the festivities continued below, Edward led Margaret to the stone balcony overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Stars sparkled in the clear winter sky as he drew her close. "My art," he whispered, his breath visible in the cold air. "I vow my love to you again, here beneath heaven's eyes." Margaret's fingers intertwined with his. "In you, I have found more than a husband," she replied softly. "I have found a partner who truly sees me." Below them, candlelight spilled from every window of Rothwell Manor, transforming the estate into a beacon that lit up the winter night, promising hope and justice to all who dwelled in the Shire. Thanks for watching. If any part of this story lingered with you, consider subscribing. I'll be here again tomorrow, sharing another tale that speaks to the soul.